Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Jeffrey Severe. I'm with the Office of the New York City Public Advocate Jumaane D. Williams. And please welcome you all to our Mental Health Symposium Day. Previously, we had an earlier panel that was focused on solitary confinement in New York City jails. And I, along with my co host, will be talking to you today about destigmatizing mental health. And I'll jump over to my co host right now to introduce.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kenita Marson. I'm the health coordinator here at the Public Advocate's Office. And I would like to thank all the panelists today and everyone watching from home. It has been an exhausting few weeks on our physical and mental health. And thank you for showing up. Unfortunately, this has become our new normal, and all of us here refuse to let this happen. Our hopes in this conversation is to not only bring awareness, but to create a much needed action.
As we spoke about our new normal earlier, we realized that none of us are the same as when the pandemic first started. This has been a trying time for everyone's emotional health, as well as the toll on all of our bodies. Sadly, even before this, we've experienced many instances where people in crisis have cried out for help and been met with little to no clear paths to support. Or worse, they've been met with deadly force. And on that note, I'm just going to go ahead and read the name of the folks who were in serious mental health crisis and were met with fatal consequences by law enforcement. We have David Kostofsky, Keel Coppin, Iman Morales, Sharice Francis, Darius Kennedy, Mohammed Ba, Rexford Dasworth, David Felix, Mario Ocasio, Anthony Paul II, Gary Conrad, Rashawn Lloyd, Deborah Danner, Ariel Galarza, Dwayne Jean, Miguel Richards, Cornell Lockhart, Dwayne Pritchett, James Owens, Michael Hansford, Saheed Vassal, Susan Muller, Kowalski Trowick, Kwesi Ashun, George Zabantis, Oud Pierre. These are all people who were killed as of just 2007, and that's a list of 25 names. So it just lets us know the gravity of what we are dealing with in this city, in this country, when folks have mental health needs that are not addressed and folks are not getting the support that they needed. And now I'll kick it over to my colleague Kanita to ask the first question.
Yes, as Jeffrey has said, we've seen an increased number of people whose mental health needs have not been met, and this has increased since 2011. Half of adults with mental illness have not received the treatment they need, totaling to over 27 million adults in the United States who are going untreated. In New York City, we've seen the mental health crisis heightened over the past few years, with hospital beds, with psychiatric beds being lost in hospitals. We've seen the homeless camp sweeps. We've seen the new mayor's subway safety plan. I ask you all, as panelists, to tell us about the need for mental health right now, mental health resources, and to tell us about the work you are doing and how critical it is for New York City. I'm going to kick it off to Solomon. I think you're muted, Solomon.
I think I muted myself after having been unmute. Hey everyone, I'm Solomon Acevedo, again, Deputy Public Advocate for Justice, Health, Equity, and Safety. He, him pronouns, and been following this work really since I was a campaign coordinator at Vocal New York, and have come to the office to really explore the intersections of mental health and criminal justice and figure out how we can really see the whole system at play and I'm really excited to be able to share with the people who are on this panel because all of them have a nuanced way of understanding and just this is the way that we get to solutions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Solomon. I'm going to kick it off to Christina. You can introduce yourself and how important this work is to you.
Hi. So my name is Christina Sparrick. I'm actually a mental health advocate in New York City. I've been advocating for at least 10 years. I myself have almost been killed by police officers when they were coming for a wellness check. And um, it's amazing how when people have a wellness check for like diabetes or any other medical issue, that they get a visiting nurse or an ambulance. But someone like me who lives with bipolar disorder has police showing up. Recently, it was not too long ago, that so I heard banging on my door, and it was the police, but I wasn't aware. And instead of my doorman calling me and telling me they were coming up, I just heard banging, and I didn't know who they were. So immediately it was that fear flight response, and I ran into the kitchen and I grabbed a knife because I was afraid of who was at my door. I'm living in New York. It's in the midst of COVID. There's a lot of noise, a lot of people shooting on TV, and you hearing a lot of stuff. So I grabbed a knife because I was going to defend myself. And of course, I'm from Brooklyn, do or die, right? And so luckily my door was unlocked. It was locked because if they would have came in, they would have shot me automatically because they would have saw a person, according to them on their body cam, a person in distress who was going to attack them because they felt unsafe. But really, I was the one that felt safe, and I had the right to carry a weapon in my house to protect myself. So that's what how the narrative would have played out because the police would have definitely changed the narrative. So now we're having a Be Heard program within New York City where 911 is actually responding to, I'm sorry, we have a new 911 mental health, I'm sorry, a new New York City Behavioral Health Emergency Assistance Response Division, which is called Be Heard. It was actually launched in the administration of de Blasio and is actually now being expanded into Brooklyn by Mayor Adams. And what it looks like, it will be one mental health professional and two EMTs, which are dispatched to a mental health emergency call. Now, that sounds good, right? The only problem is that the program only operates 16 hours a day. That means 8 hours or a third of the day, that 8 hour window, police will be responding. So there is still police responding to the Be Heard program. Also, there are times when the Be Heard team is not equipped to handle certain calls, so they automatically respond. They call 911 and they bring the police in. So the police are responding from 50 to 70% of the time. So it's not totally a non police response because police are responding. And what's missing from it also, where are the crisis trained peers who are culturally humble, trauma informed, and have practice centered care to help people in crisis? And that's what's problematic about the Be Heard program. Um, as a New Yorker, I believe we have an opportunity now to tap into the $55 million of the crisis response program that Mayor Adams has placed in his budget. I myself, I created a non-police program in Brooklyn, New York, and the training that I have is as New Yorkers, we have an opportunity to have non-police responses. I created a person-centered intervention training, a non-police mental health training program in New York City, which teaches people how to respectively engage people when they are well, becoming unwell, and in crisis. We spend too much on crisis, and we need to start connecting people to care. My program is a program where it diverts from the criminal legal system to treatment and care into the communities. We don't criminalize people, we empower through the PCIT program. What's unique about the program is that it focuses on prevention and intervention rather than crisis. And currently in PCIT Mental Health Response Pilot in Fort Greene, it's a collaborative effort between Fort Greene Park Conservancy, New York City Parks, Fountain House, and SUS, which is the Service of Underserved. And we have community advisory committee, which consists of lawyers, pastors, restaurant owners, and business people, because it's important for community members to be this, like, the community members actually know who in the community who are not well, and they can actually direct our team to the people who need the supports. um, the PCIT, we only hire people who are just as involved, people who were like homeless, people in recovery from mental health and substance use. And we named our teams the social well-being team. Social well-being team. That's a nice name to have your team to respond to someone. We trained park officers in the social well-being team for like 35 hours a week on a person-centered practices. Of course, Dr. V was there. She was part of the training. She trained in the criminal legal system. And in the park, the team, we call it touring. We don't call it patrolling. We want person-centered, strength-based language. They tour the park from 7 to 12 in the daytime, 5 days a week, and then from 7 to 12 at night. And you're probably asking why such short hours? We need funding. We were able to get $225,000 from Van Ameren Gang Foundation to fund this project, but we need more funding. What's also good about this project, to make it even more non-police, is that we have walkie-talkies. Our social well-being has walkie-talkies. The park staff has walkie-talkies. So if anything is going on in the park, we'll see it, we'll communicate with each other. It keeps the police out, and we'll handle it ourselves. We also normalize mental health. We teach mindfulness exercises and yoga in the park, so anybody in the community and park can be involved. And we have our community meetings with this, pastors and local hospitals and so forth. To date, we've been very successful. We haven't had any police involved. It was launched back in October of 2021. We have connected people to shelters and safe havens. We've helped 10 people advocate for HRAs and DHS. 4 people were assisted with identifications. We helped 2 people with SNAP applications, and we were able to connect this one woman who was living with, DV, substance use. We were able to connect this individual with her family. And connecting that individual with their family actually gives them hope to actually change their life. And that's a positive outcome, and that's all we want. It's that continuum of care, the continuum of care and treatment and love, and an unconditional positive regard that we give to other people. It's not a quick fix when it comes to mental health. It's that long process of developing rapport and being credible messengers. So that's what we do well in our program.
Thank you so much, Christina. I'd like to ask Allison the same question. How did you become a mental health advocate, and how vital is the work you're doing in the city right now?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Allison Wilkie, and I'm the coordinator for the Fair Chance for Housing campaign. And I want to thank the Public Advocate for having this really important conversation. I've been working and fighting for the rights of people who have been incarcerated for almost 2 decades, just fighting for basic rights for people to be able to move on and move forward with their lives after incarceration. And a lot of that work in recent years has centered on housing and access to housing, because we know that housing is a key part of mental health, and yet too many people who exit incarceration don't have access to housing, whether it's supportive housing, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's public housing. People don't have access because of background checks and bars to access. Nationwide, 79% of formerly incarcerated people and their families say that they've been denied housing because of a criminal conviction. And we know that people exiting state prison, 40% of people released from state prisons to New York City go directly to shelters. 11% of single adults entering shelters in New York City cite release from jail or prison as the reason for their homelessness. And in the earlier panel, a lot of folks were talking about the deep mental health impacts of solitary confinement and of just incarceration. So we're releasing people who have experienced deep trauma while in jail or prison, and then expecting them to move forward with their lives while they're being denied housing because of background checks, while they can't get housing in a city that already has an affordability crisis and a housing access crisis. And people end up in shelter systems where they also experience violence, where they also experience trauma. And this is not just folks themselves who've been incarcerated. This is their entire family. This is the entire support system of someone who can help people, with their mental health concerns. So that's where my focus has been, is really making sure that there's housing for folks after incarceration, so that people can move forward and can take care of their mental health. Because how do we expect people to take care of their mental health when they don't have a stable place to call home, when they don't have a place to store their belongings, when they don't have a place to lay their head at night where they feel safe? That's an impossibility. It's an impossibility, and we can't move forward. We can't move forward with closing Rikers. We can't move forward with addressing the mental health crisis without addressing people's access to housing. So I'm really grateful to be here and talk about that element of mental health and that element of fixing our jail system.
Thank you so much, Allison. Housing is a critical part of mental health for sure. I'd like to ask Dr. Victoria to step in and tell us about the work that you do.
Peace and blessings, everyone. I'm Chaplain Dr. Victoria Phillips. Everyone calls me Dr. V. And I do a lot of work. It's all centered around community health and justice. And for many years, I've worked in nursing and in mental health, the psych units and things like that, in ER, and ended up working in prisons and jails. And that is what really brought me to the forefront of advocating for those returning home or behind correctional walls. It's barbaric. I'm an Army brat, and I think that's also one of the reasons that I stepped into the forefront, because driving over the bridge from Rikers Island, and something clicked inside of my head one day, and it was just like, this is unacceptable. The conditions are unacceptable. I'm talking about over a decade ago. It just clicked. Like, working in prisons, you develop a mindset that people are there because they're convicted. I'm not saying it's the right mindset, but you develop society's mindset that they must have done something unjust to land in prison. But it was shocking to me that the same conditions, or even worse conditions, that I saw in prisons were in our local jail system. And what's even more shocking was that people will be placed in situations not even being convicted. It doesn't make it right, but not even being convicted of their alleged crime, and then placed in conditions where the very people that are put in oversight, that are supposed to help them in these barbaric conditions, don't even follow up or do their job. And so it's like, when you're unseen, when you're unheard, when you're not believed, when you're forgotten by the very community members or elected officials who begged for your vote at one time, what do you do and who do you turn to? You turn to no one. When you're stuck in a cell or pushed, into a dorm somewhere and forgotten, or not even taken to court, or not even taken to medical, who's going to fight for you? And that's why I jumped into this movement and became a voice for those unseen and unheard. I won't hold up any more time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Victoria. Being forgotten by the system is why mental health, we have such a mental health crisis right now. So thank you so much for the work that you do. I'd like to ask Marco to step in and tell us about the work that you do and how vital it is for New York right now.
Thank you for having me. My name is Marco Barrios. I'm a criminal justice advocate with the Urban Justice Center Mental Health Project. I monitor the discharge planning services on the Brad H class members. Those are people with mental health needs, especially those with severe mental illness. I came to this work I started advocating back in 2017 after doing 24 years and 6 months, and not having not one moment any type of treatment for my mental health needs. I had to do self-care health. And also I another job I do is not a job. I won't call it a job, a passion of mine. Is the Treatment Not Jails Act. This is a bill that really will address a lot of the challenges that people with mental health needs, as well as disabilities. We was definitely seeing, once this bill passes, that it would decarcerate New York and get people the treatment they need instead of jail. But before I go there, I want to talk a little bit about the Brad H. One of the frustrating things about trying to monitor this discharge planning services is the lack of resources in our communities. Addison spoke about supportive housing. There's not enough beds. And those individuals that need help should get, if you want public safety, people need resources. right? But that's why we don't need people in New York City jails or prisons. And New York relies too much on the jails and prisons as the primary treatment provider for people with mental health needs. Now, I'm sorry, I'm gonna turn this off. Currently, the mental health and other treatment are available in most, are not available in most counties in our state, and many people go without going to mental health court or having resources. The Treatment Not Jails Act would expand these treatment courts, or we call them diversion courts, and it would be accepted for people with mental health concerns, intellectual disabilities, and other conditions that cause functional impairment. These disabilities actually are what contribute for people going to have involvement in the criminal legal system, or make jail and prison crueler outcome than they are for people without disabilities. The Treatment Not Jail also creates more efficient and fair process and shifts approach of the current diversion court. I'm reading from some notes here, but I'm going to be straight from the heart. The Treatment Not Jails will not just address the current crisis we have in the jails and in prisons, but to actually get people the treatment they need. We constantly see the media talk about people going in and out and getting, bringing up their past history about mental health treatment, all that. But the jails, the treatment you get in there is inappropriate. It really does not treat anybody. And especially if it's a punitive model we have in place at these jails and prisons, it even makes it worse. It re-traumatizes the individuals. So the Treatment Not Jails Act would just take away the power away from the judges and the DAs, because they're not clinicians, and give it to the clinicians to make that determination whether a person needs treatment instead of jails. Another aspect of the bill is that it would be pre-plea. In other words, you don't have to plead guilty in order to get treatment. Just like if I go to a doctor with a laceration, am I going to have to stay in a jail just for the laceration? Are they just going to put a Band-Aid on it, or they're going to treat it, make sure it doesn't get infected, right? And so the Treatment Not Jails would just make the public much safer, because we'll actually get people treated for their conditions. Also, it will ensure that the treatment and support are available to everyone, regardless of their immigration status, right? Because if the person gets in trouble, what happens? ICE gets involved, right? Also, it would promote the public safety, relying on a robust body of research that consistently shows that jails leads to more, not less, criminal involvement. And as these studies show, our collective experience demonstrate incarceration is profoundly destabilizing, traumatizing for individuals. Now, I go into prisons, jails once a week. And recently I seen the conditions in there are far worse than when I was in there. And also how they put people not supposed to with mental health conditions in these so-called solitary confinements, which still in place, with which the state banned last year. So how are you going to treat people, human beings? Because I worked in the POW camp prior to when I was in the war, and we treated the prisoners there than we treat our own people. You know, we have this Geneva Convention. Why don't they apply to people in our own country? No more to say.
Can I just jump in really quick?
Thank you so much, Marco, for saying all that. Thank you for your experience, and thank you for the work that you're doing. It's really needed. Yeah, definitely go and jump in, Dr. Reed.
I just wanted to add to what Marco was saying and say that the T&J model, the treatment non-jail model, the path from treatment court to recovery really covers 6 things: clinical evaluation, hearing on eligibility and admissions, treatment planning, admission to treatment courts, compliance or non-compliance, and upon completion, the court must dismiss and seal the case. And so that is extremely important to highlight, because dismissing and sealing the case also assists someone with their reentry, also assists someone with their housing eligibility, where Allison could talk more on that. It assists someone in so many ways on becoming a productive citizen upon reentry that we overlook in so many different ways. And I just wanted to touch on those 6 things that T&J will have with the path from treatment court to recovery. I think recovery is a super important part of reentry that is a lot of times overlooked in these talks. Just wanted to jump in there with that.
No, thank you for explaining further for us. And thank you to all the panelists. All the work you're doing is amazing. And I just wanted to jump into the next question. Like we've seen in the pandemic, our mental health well-being has been exacerbated. It has created opportunity. This has created opportunities to form vital resources that there's a gap. The city has lacked the resources to meet the needs of New Yorkers. And this is what's been said throughout the panel so far. What we're hearing is that the reason that our mental health response is basically the police. And we've seen countless deaths that could have been prevented with trained mental health officials, and the toll it takes on families and loved ones that are left behind to pick up these pieces. It is Black and Brown communities that have been disproportionately impacted by this. So I ask you all, what can the city do in terms of mental health programs, such as Be Heard, to expand further? And how are these frameworks for these programs insufficient with the needs that our community needs? So I would ask Dr. V to jump in, since you kind of already started.
Oh, okay. I will jump in, but I'm gonna need you to repeat part of that question. I'm a brain surgery survivor, and you said a lot of words in that question.
Oh, so. No. Okay. No, I was going to say, how insufficient are the programs being created by the city to address the needs in our community?
Oh, well, bringing it back to the criminal legal system, I believe earlier I had stated in another panel that I don't think enough is being done. When we talk about Be Heard, I was always disgusted with it. For so long, it sat as a pilot. And then when they started it, I believe it started in the Upper East Side. So it wasn't even in a community or a zip code that sees a lot of the responses from police where mental health concerns are, festering in the city, or even responses on how police has ended lives by responding to a mental health call without adequate training. And so that was alarming to me. And then the fact that it sat as years, 16 hours, and now it's being expanded still with the 16-hour thought process. Working in nursing and ER for many years, I immediately thought of the times I worked in CPAP. And the night shift, the overnight shift. And there was even jokes for many years, don't get stuck on the overnight shift, but I love the overnight shift because there were so many enhanced calls that came in. And my thing is, who's consulting the city that they don't understand that the ER should never close? We understand that concept. So why is it okay for limited response to the people of New York City who might be in a mental health crisis? To me, that's unacceptable. To me, for us to be such a liberal city, to throw money, millions of money, so many places in so many ways, and completely overlook the issue, that's just as alarming as the commissioner who submitted a plan to change Rikers' population and push it forward without even a sentence on addressing the mental health population and what that will look like in pushing the work forward. So I think the city needs to pause. I think that we as a collective need to bring in the experts at the table, at the forefront, bring in directly impacted so that we can actually build a solid foundation to assist our community members and plug in all the loopholes that have allowed so many to fall through for so long. And I just think that Be Heard needs to be scrapped and rebuilt. And that's just my personal opinion. No affiliations with any groups or any contracts. That's just Dr. V's personal opinion from working in hospitals, working in shelters, and working in jails for so many years, and just seeing the different ways the city falls short. And I'll finish with this. Mr. Carter, a recent death in Rikers Island they say committed suicide 2 days after being in Rikers. And we have to ask ourselves, how did we fail a 25-year-old that he would take his life? What was troubling him so much that he would take his life 2 days after being in jail? And then I'm thinking, my God, you only have your brain completely formed, according to the doctors, at 24, 25. So here's a 25-year-old who just had his brain completely developed and has already experienced homelessness, has already been hospitalized for months. Where was the proper discharge planning when the hospital released him? If he was released to a shelter, why wasn't he released to something that could deal with his circumstances or mental or medical needs? And then what happened with the arresting officer? Why were they not able to pick up that something additional needed to be in his services? What happened to the judge that remanded him? Then we have the intake officer in DLC, and then we have CHS, Correctional Health Services, who was supposed to assess him while in intake. Did they even reach this young man to properly assess him? Because if they had, then they should have known he needs to be moved immediately from that area for higher level of care. And so I think every level that was supposed to have a safety net already failed him. So we as a city, as a collective, as city council, as public advocate, as CBOs on this call, we all have to do better. We all have to push harder because the system is broken and it's our fault that it isn't fixed.
Thank you so much, Dr. V. And I do completely agree with you that, we have to do better as a system to aid those who go through it. I definitely want to ask Christina if you can jump in and tell us how you think these frameworks are insufficient to address the needs of our community.
Thank you for asking that question. Definitely to have any successful program, you need to have the people directly impacted at the table to be part of the planning, designing, and implementation and assessment of the program itself. With the Be Heard program, it seemed like it was only city agencies actually doing all of the planning, designing, and implementation. And people like myself who are community activists and mental health advocates and a person who lives with mental health concerns were not asked to be part of the whole process at all. We have $55 million now to work with. And we can definitely have crisis mobile teams. If we want to have an alternative response, non-police response, we can have crisis mobile teams. If I'm not mistaken, we only have 24 teams and they respond up to 2 hours at a time. And during that 2 hour time when you're having a crisis, it can escalate to the point where someone feels that they have to call police, which is not fair. We need to invest that $55 million into a crisis mobile team so we'll have more and they'll have a rapid response to actually de-escalate the person and possibly transfer them to a more funded respite center within the community. So it's all about prevention and intervention for me. Also with CCIT NYC model, they have a crisis model that advocates for a peer-driven response model, which is also good. And also you have community-based pilots like I have at PCIT and Fort Greene. There could be other pilots within the communities that can have that, but make it more tailored to the community, to the culture of the community, so it could be more effective within the community. So these are different types of ways we can actually help people in more prevention and intervention as opposed to crisis. Thanks.
So much, Christina. I'd like Allison if you could jump in and just tell us a bit about the work you're doing, and can you tell us how these frameworks to address mental health in the city are insufficient for our communities?
Well, you said it before, our response to mental health crises has been more police. And right now we have a situation in the city where we have a lot of people who are unhoused and who also have mental health concerns. And the response from politicians has been more police. This is a public safety issue. They call it a public safety issue, and that means more police. But let's be real, New Yorkers actually know better. There was a survey recently that asked 62,000 New York City residents to pick 3 public safety priorities, and those 62,000 New Yorkers chose affordable housing and reducing homelessness most often. So New Yorkers understand that access to housing is our pathway to public safety. Investing in more police, investing in more jails, hiring more corrections officers, None of that is going to achieve public safety. We really do have to make sure that we're putting the money in places that is going to work. And that is about finding people housing so that they can have the stability to seek care. They can have the stability to move forward. I mean, when we're talking about treatment, even in courts, which of course I totally support treatment, not jails, but historically, one of the factors that judges have used to either set bail on people or to deny them treatment and choose incarceration instead is lack of stable housing. So the lack of housing is a feeder into the criminal justice system, and it also impacts people when they come out. The Fair Chance for Housing campaign that I lead with many people, including Dr. V, would prohibit housing providers from doing background checks and from denying people housing because they have a conviction record. It is something that will stop the cycle of people going between shelter and jail and treatment and endlessly going in that cycle because they never have the stability of a place to call home. You know, this is a mass incarceration issue. And let's look at what mass incarceration looks like in New York City. We have almost 750,000 New York City residents who have a conviction record. That's actually 11% of the adult population. And all of these people, when they go to find housing, get background checks run on them. Background checks are just a core part of how we do business these days, as if background checks were some kind of predictor of the future or some kind of predictor of whether someone was going to be a good tenant. And it is none of those things. And yet that is what stops people from being able to access housing. We have background checks happening in supportive housing, which is designed, I mean, much of it is designed, it's definitely designed for people who have a mental health diagnosis, but it's also designed for people who are supposed to be exiting incarceration. And yet we have background checks. And too often, the people who have a conviction record get denied supportive housing, which would be the best option for helping them move forward. We have background checks in affordable housing. We have background checks in public housing. We have background checks in market rate housing. This is a huge barrier for folks. They exit incarceration and have no place to go. And even joining the lease of a family member puts that family member at risk of eviction because landlords, whether they're public or private, deny people housing when they have conviction records, when they do that background check. So we're trying to end background checks as a way of stopping this cycle of instability that impacts people's mental health, that impacts their entry and exit into jail or prisons, and that impacts their ability even to take advantage of treatment. And I just want to call it out, if folks want to get involved in Fair Chance for Housing, you can go to fairchancehousing.org, sign up there to get emails about the campaign, about what we're doing. We're trying to pass this at the city level. It's something that the city can do that would really impact people's needs by tearing down the obstacles that folks have to housing.
Thank you so much for that, Allison. And I think all of you for kind of like tying in those answers together. I'm actually going to stay right here with you, Allison, because just to touch on kind of what you mentioned about how folks are cycling in and out of the shelter system, and just kind of how this is actually we have a mass incarceration plan, and we're kind of like masquerading it sometimes as a housing plan. So I think we mentioned it a little bit earlier at the top about the subway safety plan that was launched after there were a certain number of incidents that were on New York City subways. And I just want to find a way if we could talk about how that is, how coupling it with the encampment sweeps, about how both of those are actually not things that are conducive to finding housing. Because from my understanding, the way it was supposed to work is that there are supposed to be folks at the end of the line who are accompanied by police officers, which is already kind of a flag, but also having like peers and whatnot who are lived experience to encounter folks on the subways who might need supportive housing, who might need help, who might have mental health issues. And a lot of times there's a disconnect between them actually getting those services, and the very exact same thing with the folks in the encampments, because we're seeing that a lot of those folks have mental health issues as well. And they also do not get access to they don't get the access to the services that they need, because they would need the same exact supports. So could you talk to us a little bit about how those are actually things that we think that we're doing to help, but they're actually doing the complete opposite, and they're actually criminalizing folks who actually have mental health issues?
Yeah, both the subway sweeps, the homeless encampment suites, they haven't helped people get housing. any politician's lie that that's what they're doing is wrong. It's been shown that people aren't going in and getting housing. And the fact is when they say that these teams are going to come out and help connect people to housing, what they're saying is they're going to connect people to the shelter system, where people are going to stay for a year or 2 years and maybe get out at some point and be able to find housing. It's not a pathway to direct housing. And let's think about this. Even in those situations where there are peer advocates or other folks accompanying police, you still have a police presence there. And I want to be clear, like, that hasn't been the case in all of these situations. There's video of plenty of encampment sweeps where it is only police and sanitation who are throwing people's belongings away and just clearing them out of there. But even anytime you have a police presence in these situations, it's going to have a chilling effect. It's going to have a chilling effect, especially on people who've experienced incarceration, who've experienced state violence by the police and by corrections, right? People aren't going to welcome the police coming to clear them out of the space that they've managed to carve for themselves with open hands and say, oh yes, take me to housing that doesn't exist. People have experience with the shelter system. And most folks who are on the street have experience with the shelter system and have made a choice, and they are making a valid choice for themselves not to be in the shelter system. And so saying that these sweeps, that these encampments are going to have an impact on homelessness is just proven to be absolutely wrong. Very few people have actually entered the shelter system after being swept up. And then on top of that, very few have actually stayed in the shelter system, because the shelter system doesn't connect people to housing quickly. It just doesn't do it. And for the folks that I work with in the campaign, too many of them have been through the shelter system, and they even eventually have been able to get a voucher, like a City FEPS voucher or another voucher that would enable them to help pay rent in this very unaffordable city. But they spend years, months and years with these vouchers, going to landlord after landlord, submitting application after application, only to be denied because they have a conviction record. So even all of our programs, all of our efforts that we're putting in to try and move people from shelter to housing are failing when people just get face denials because of background checks.
Thank you so much, because I just thought that really needed to be named, because we kind of have I know that we're framing it in the city as a program to aid folks who are on the subways, to aid folks who are on the streets, to aid folks who have housing insecurity. But in reality, what it ends up being is just us rounding up folks who are having mental health crises and folks who need mental health services. And I actually just want to kind of follow up to my follow-up about that, Allison, if you could, because I know that and I would also like, if Dr. V specifically, or Christina, I don't know if you guys want to jump in over here very specifically, because I know that they mentioned one of the things that we've been doing and pushing forward is bringing up the idea of Kendra's law, in terms of like attempting against folks' will to commit them, and see if that can be something that's a service to our city. And if you could talk about that real lightly as well. And then if Christina or Dr. V especially would want to jump in, or anyone else.
Well, I mean, the thing with Kendra's law is it's mental health services against people's will, but there aren't the mental health services. That's not the problem, right? The mental health services don't exist at the end of it. And so we need better mental health services. We need connections to mental health services, because if they aren't there, then this idea that we're forcing people into services that don't exist it's putting the focus on the wrong part of the problem. Just like with the public safety issue, we're putting the focus on policing more people when that's the wrong part of the problem. With Kendra's law, we're putting the focus on having stricter rules or more openness to being able to force people into treatment, but we actually don't have the treatment available. And so we need a wholesale rethinking of where we're investing resources if we really want to tackle these issues.
Thank you. And if Dr. V or Christina, and also in your response, either Dr. V or Christina, if you could possibly also mention like the importance, like Allison referenced, the importance of like having peers or folks with lived experience to be involved in just kind of helping folks along the way.
When I was listening to Allison just now, I thought of a conversation I had. Can y'all hear me? I can't even see now.
Yes.
I just okay, thank you. I thought of a conversation I had with a chief judge a couple months ago, and the judge was saying how they're very fearful to release individuals, especially, and this was like direct words, fearful because they don't want to open up the post the next day and the person they release is on the post. So in that conversation, they were saying they would rather incarcerate so they could get the services pretty much. And I immediately brought to that judge's attention, you do know that the Department of Corrections rarely meets minimum standards, correct? And so even one hoping to send someone in the system to receive the treatment that they know they're not going to receive in the community because there's no proper resources, is an injustice. Because even with the idea that because they're in care, custody, and control of the Department of Corrections, they have to receive services, that is a must for them. Oftentimes they don't. And so we know that people with a Brad H diagnosis need to be seen at least 28 days, every 28 days minimum standards in New York City Department of Corrections. And a lot of times they fall short on even that. And I wanted to highlight that because who are we incarcerating? Who are we cycling through the shelter system? And really quickly, since we were speaking on the shelter system, I wanted to highlight from working in shelters many years, the shelter system is a literal design of our correctional dormitory system. And so even in that mindset, we're not teaching people to be independent, to be better, we're teaching people to have a mindset of being in prison, to remain feeling less than, not having adequate baseline of a foundation and things like that. And so, Christina, I know you probably want to jump in here, but I wanted to just highlight that because we need to start, when we talked earlier about educating and organizing, it even starts with our judges. It starts with what is available in the community. It starts with who's available in the community. It starts with our clergy. Clergy is always rounding up the community to come vote for the electeds, but then the electeds fall short on what they give back to the community. And so even in that mindset, instead of the police response, who could you reach out to that's a grassroots organization or a community leader like clergy who could diffuse? Very simple. Happened yesterday when the alleged person who was the alleged shooter for the train incident turned himself in after clergy negotiated a peaceful surrender. That's exactly what I'm talking about. We can utilize leaders in our community rather than a police response, and we need to educate our judges because people should have a right on domestic soil to what care they want, what medical response and treatment they feel that they need. As a brain surgery survivor who was ignored by a very prestigious hospital over 8 times and had the option to leave and go to another hospital that said I need emergency brain surgery, could not leave from there. I use that example all the time when I'm speaking about health and health care and access to it, because that first hospital ignored me, ignored what I said, and looked at me as a Black woman, thought I was crazy, and all the other things that they said to me, discriminating. But I still had the option to walk out. People behind the walls, people actually suffering with mental health concerns, sometimes do not have an option to advocate for themselves in ways that will actually bring relief, that will actually help make them become stable. And so that's our job on the outside. That's our job to push policy. That's our job to make sure that everything that's needed for people on the return, whether it's hospitalization or incarceration, is there for them. As a society, that's our job.
Thank you so much for that. And I really appreciate how you tied in folks who don't have the option to leave from jail, kind of in a similar way to Kendra's law, which is folks having their agency removed from them. They're not also able, because they're committed at that point. And Christina, could you just jump in and touch real quick about the question about Kendra's law and how it, and also in how some of these programs would really benefit from folks having their peers and folks who have lived experience into kind of supporting them?
So, excuse me. So I agree with Dr. V about having more community members involved. When you think about it, sometimes grandma on the corner or Aunt May on the corner has been raised. She knew John when he was only 2 years old and how he was raised in his environment with the abuse in the home, or the father who was the alcoholic or something like that. And she witnessed it. And she understood how to engage with him by maybe having the sweet potato pie on Sundays when he came in, or she would run into the street and say, "Hey, John, I see that you're going through something." And she knew how to communicate with him because she was trauma informed, person centered, and culturally humble. It's always good to get the community members and the pastors, like Dr. V said, to get involved in engaging with people. And this is what peers also bring into the community. Peers are also people who walk, talk, think like the people who are well, becoming unwell, and in crisis, because we've been through that journey. We know how to navigate systems. So there's alternatives. We can actually get to the people beforehand, before that crisis escalates, before they end up into the system.
Thank you so much, Christina. And I think Solomon, I know you were going to try to like jump in there about the Kendra's Law piece.
Yeah, just wanted to share the ways in which we often try to find a simple solution to fixing what we don't understand. And I think the reason why we're having this panel around destigmatizing mental health is because it's scary to not know what's going on. And I feel that we're often driven by that fear when we encounter individuals who may seem to be exhibiting behavior that seems threatening. But we have to be able to listen to people with lived experience to help us decode that mysterious behavior. And I think that when we're able to, at a baseline as a community, lift that understanding and give people the tools to de-escalate, just as a general public, it allows individuals to step into the agency that they do have. As Ms. V was mentioning, we already utilize individuals in our community who are leaders, who have a nuanced influence to connect people who we consider unreachable. And so rather than only consult those people in order to gain some kind of consensus, those people, like Christina was saying, should be the ones who are directly involved in the solution. And when it comes to Kendra's Law, there's so many reasons why not knowing who a person is can be extremely damaging when involuntarily committed. And the expansion of it, which would include someone who doesn't know you're reporting you to law enforcement to then come and take you to a hospital, is just completely against what it means to support mental health. And so I really am hoping that when we think through these policies, that we're not just trying to satisfy headlines and the media current that tells us that we have to act fast to address the mental health problem. We can't act fast on something that has been created systemically, slowly, over generations. And so what we need to do is act thoughtfully, act together, so that we can actually bring the solutions across agencies. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Solomon. And Marco, I know you've been quiet for a little bit here. I was going to ask, I know that folks have been doing a lot of speaking here about the pretty much folks to shelter to prison pipeline and back and forth and vice versa. And I know you shared your story previously, and you also mentioned about just literally the treatment of folks in the New York City jails and how it was just terrible compared to like how you were instructed to kind of treat POW members. But what were some ways that you think that folks could be supported when they're like coming home, or just even ways that folks could be supported before they're getting themselves into a situation where they're going to find themselves incarcerated? Or what are things that have been helpful for you, or things that you in your day-to-day, as you're speaking to folks who might be in similar situations, and things that you can kind of find ways to highlight them?
Well, I believe in prevention, intervention, and reentry. Christina mentioned that about prevention. We shouldn't have to wait for a person to go into a crisis to help them. There is, and everyone mentioned about the lack of resources, but even if we have resources, we have to be careful that we don't put people in situations like Kendra's Law to do more harm than good. Mandatory treatment, studies show it doesn't work. When we focus on more of a client-centered environment and some of these service providers, then we have more long-lasting recovery. One of the things that I came to my mind is one of my clients, and I'm not trying to get emotional here because it really troubled me when I spoke to him, when he's telling me his experience when he was picked up by the police in the subway because of his mental health condition, he just got paranoid. And then they sent him to a shelter, and he thought he was going to stay there. They told him he was going to be able to stay there. And the next morning, they gave him breakfast, and they told him, you have to leave. Those are the things that break a person down, their dignity. And, the solution is doing Kendra's law. How can that help? That's just like putting a Band-Aid on an infected wound. We have to address the underlying issues of not public safety, but public health. Because if we address the public health, we won't see the mass incarceration we're witnessing now. People dying in jails. The treatment in jails, I could be here all day talking about that. It's more like, and I've told people in the past, if you're trying to seek comprehensive treatment, individualized or comprehensive, you're not going to get it in jail. It's mostly like one shoe fits all. And if you don't comply, they punish you for not, or they say that you refuse the treatment. And from my experience, when I tried to mention it to the mental health staff that I had a diagnosis of PTSD, they didn't want to even address that. It took the VA hospital actually to call the facility to make sure that I see someone. But at the end, I just got this, self-study, got my education, and thank God, things work well for me. But for most people, it doesn't. And you expect people to come out and be productive citizens without community involvement, it doesn't work.
Marco, first of all, thank you so much for bringing us back to a place where we realized that what this conversation really was about was the human beings. And again, thank you so much for sharing and just bringing us into your story about how you were treated and just how it can be an example for the city not to do things. You mentioned a really key word there that I kind of stayed on, which was dignity, because you told the story of the gentleman, I'm assuming it was a gentleman, who was in the shelter and then is asked basically to leave. And I understand that what this person saw the shelter as was kind of some sort of okay, no matter how bad it is here, I have a refuge, I have a roof over my head, I know where I'm going to be, I know where my next meal is going to come from. And I think that that's what we are really trying to do here in the Office of the Public Advocate, is try to find ways that folks can be made whole and be treated like human beings and have dignity and know that they are in a situation where there's help that can be coming. And I know we mentioned that there's lacking of resources. I actually don't like when we say that, because I think the resources are there. We just misallocate them, and we don't actually, for instance, we send a lot of money to the NYPD that would make sense to be sent to preventative care. And I want to see if I guess Allison, you could almost touch into this, where the piece about you do so much of your work is about housing. And I know housing is kind of fundamental, because you're saying this is where this is how folks can be respected in society as full members of society. This is where folks can be made whole. But then can you speak to the piece about the fact that what it's not like to have housing, where folks are just kind of beaten up, and it just kind of breaks their spirit because they don't have a place that is their own, and the effects of what it is when a person actually goes through all the voucher system and then actually is able to find housing. So yeah, I'm actually asking for success story a little bit.
Sure. It's trauma upon trauma. We have campaign members who, have been in the shelter system for months going on years, and, who exited prison, with hopes for themselves. Some of them were able to get some college classes or even start college in the community after incarceration. And they end up in the system that makes it impossible for them to move forward, to find jobs, and just dehumanized by this system. On top of that, as they look for housing, as they look to use these vouchers that exist, they pay application fees for housing to try and rent apartments, and they have to pay for background checks. You have to pay that fee to pay for a background check that you're going to be denied at the end of the day. And it just wears people down. We know that there's trauma that comes from living the shelter system. We know that there's trauma from living on the street. And so we're just compounding people's trauma. And I want to just call Dr. V into the conversation too, because I know that she wants to make a point here on housing and its importance to reentry and how people are impacted by lack of housing.
Thanks so much, Allison. I just really wanted to touch base and say, so often we put houseless individuals into a separate category. And I remember I always talk about being an Army brat, but I often talk about being in foster care as well. And our foster care system to this day still fails our young adults. And I remember AWOLing from foster care just so I wouldn't get raped and actually sleeping on Coney Island's beach. There used to be a park with a sliding board in the sand. I used to dig a hole underneath the sliding board. And so people couldn't really see me from the boardwalk and sleep in that hole underneath the sliding board. Or either I would ride the trains. And I often think, my God, they're pulling people off the trains to do what with them? To put them in a shelter system where they can be beaten, robbed, or raped just as bad in the street. And I say all of that because housing is a critical key point to building up or anyone re-entering society, whether it's foster care, incarceration, hospitalization. There's so many key points to re-entry, and housing is the solid foundation to uplift and build any individual for any of those key points. And we also have to think when people are looking for housing, it impacts them if they're a parent. Many parents don't have access to their child simply because upon incarceration, they might have had their child go into the foster care system or at least come before a family court judge. If you don't have stable housing, how can you prove to a judge that you are now becoming productive, that you are now on the right path? So it's a domino effect. And what does that look like for our youth when they've been disconnected from their parent or guardian for however long of incarceration or hospitalization, and then they come back into the community and they still can't necessarily be with them? Or people have to choose from going to a place where they can get steady treatment if they need it, or apply for a voucher where they can have their children come live with them. So even in our supportive housing models that we have already, why aren't we including families? Housing and access to treatment. And then I wanted to highlight one more thing when it comes to reentry. Disabilities. So many people have physical disabilities and mental health concerns that are all considered disabilities in the DSM-5, period. And my point is, when we talk about housing or low income or adequate or safe housing, all these things have to be pointed out for our people. Is it safe housing? Is it going to be accommodating for their disabilities? It's not just housing. Is it going to accommodate their individual needs? Is it going to... So when we talk about reentry, we have to also look at that domino effect, because we are only as strong as our weakest link in our community. I'll stop there.
Dr. V, I wrote that down from when you said that earlier at the last panel, and I was actually going to literally bring that up. So I think it's really serendipitous that you just said that, because I realized when Marco made that mention of the client of his who had to leave the homeless shelter, it struck me about the fact that everything we're talking about here is about safety, and we're talking about community. And whether we're talking about with Allison, who's speaking about it specifically with in terms of housing, or speaking about it with Christina, where we're speaking about folks who are having literal mental health crises and what ways that folks can intervene and give them support. Whether or not we're talking about it with Marco, we're talking about how folks are having their issues being exacerbated by their treatment in the criminal legal system. Whether we're talking about with Dr. V, who's talking about it through all of those issues, because have no bounds. But I also just come to think that we're all talking about the fact that people are looking for safety. They're looking for support from their community, and the resources are there because the resources are us. The resources are everyone who is here. And I know that earlier today as well, just not to mention, is that we were talking about Rikers Island, and we were talking about how actually the public advocate was mentioning that how Rikers Island is basically one of the biggest services of mental health treatment in the country. And it's extremely, really disheartening that everybody on this call knows and is extremely aware about how we funnel everyone in who we funnel everybody into the issue areas that you all work in. We funnel them into the criminal legal system, and it does not serve us well as a community. And I guess my question here is, how can the everyday citizens, how can we all, and how can folks who are watching this today, maybe folks who are watching this 3 weeks from now, maybe folks who are watching this a year from now, can be in support of the work that you do more specifically? And you guys are just feel free to just take that for yourself at any order. Little Hunger Gamesy.
Well, I can start. I mentioned it before. Folks can go to fairchancehousing.org. The link is in the chat, and click on the Take Action button there. From there, you can sign up to get updates about our campaign. You can also either tweet your council member or send them a message by email telling them that we need fair chance for housing. We need to stop denying people housing because they have a conviction record. People need access to housing. If we are going to have safe communities, safe individuals, and people, allowing people in the city to live with dignity. So go there and take action right now.
Yeah, for me, I'm sorry, I'm in a public place. For me, it would be great if people can go to fortgreenparkconservancy.org and look under programs, and look up for person-centered events and training. We need donations for like clothing and socks and foods, and possibly money for Metro cards for people trying in the park users are looking for supports. Volunteer also, we need that support. And we're looking for more funding overall because we need to fill in the gap from 7 to 12, that gap between 6 and 9 at night, to get full support for the park. Thanks.
Hello. For me, it would be but for the Treatment Not Jail campaign, just reach out to the legislators and let them know about the Treatment Not Jails Act and how effective it would be for decarceration and actually for public safety and public health. And also just vote for the right people. If they're not accountable, vote them out. Simple as that. And you once you vote for them and they don't comply, you see that they're not doing what they're supposed to do during that, when they mention it in that campaign, just make them accountable. Social media, I've learned a lot about social media. So just tag people, let them know they're not doing what they're supposed to do, and just vote for the right people.
Marco's really nice about it. I would suggest run up on your electors the same way they come into your community doing voting times and they beg for your vote. Run up on them and let them know. I'm not saying disrespectfully, but run up on them respectfully and let them know you're accountable to your constituents. That's one. Start showing up at your community board members. So often we think we don't have power, but we do, and we have it in numbers. And part of the local education starts by even showing up to your local community board. And that could be where you live or where you work at. Join them both if you want. But my point is, get involved. And when I say that, because something as simple as a real estate developer, or even getting permission to build in your community, they have to first visit your community board. And if you're not a part of that meeting, you can't voice your opinion or at least advocate for a certain amount of apartments in the unit to go to low-income housing. This is how we start controlling the narrative in our own community at our very doorstep. Also, attend your city council hearings. If you can't attend them, work out something in your community where a couple of people who are off on that day can actually show up or go testimony. There's elders in the neighborhood, Miss Ann and Miss Susie. Somebody's going to watch your kid. It's going to give you 3 or 4 hours to get to city council and put your voice on the record. Stop by my website, visionaryv.com, and get involved in so many other things. Again, visionaryv.com. And I would encourage you to send me an email, info@visionaryv.com, so that I can make sure that you get on the listserv for the Jails Action Coalition. We do a lot of amazing things to hold DOC accountable and make sure that our community members have their human rights afforded to them in the minimum standards, or join the Halt Solitary Act Coalition, or even the Justice for Women coalition that I'm a part of. And we meet quite often. If you are concerned about the women and want to remove them off the island or what's going to look like for them in the community, send me an email, info@visionarv.com, and I'll make sure you get on that listserv. But one thing I want to say is show up with your level of comfortability. It starts with us, and I'm not going to browbeat you about what you should be doing, but I'm going to encourage you and I'm going to meet you where you're at and suggest that you do what you're comfortable in doing with this movement to make sure that your neighbors and everyone else has their human rights and has everything that is supposed to be afforded to them. Because at any given day, any of us could be homeless. I've been in the fire before. Any of us could be arrested. I've been arrested before. Any of us could end up in the situations that all of us on this panel today are highlighting and fighting to change. Peace and blessings.
Thank you so much for those closing words. I also want to just, say just two things that are really, really short, but that kind of encompass everything we talked about is that, so I believe solitary confinement is torture. I believe that housing is a human right. And I believe that there are a lot of resources in our city, and that's one of the things that our office is charged with, is making sure that agencies are run the way they should be and that folks are doing their job. So I was very pleased to hear you speak about, both you and Dr. V and Marco speak about accountability, because that is very important to hold your elected officials accountable. And yes, I'm gonna just give some space to my colleagues if they would like to say some words as we part. Anita?
Yeah, I just want to thank all the panelists. The conversation was amazing. And I think, like we said before, our aim was not to just bring awareness to all these issues that you all have brought up, but to actually have actions brought about from government and local officials that to do something in the neighborhoods, to do something about, and to start de-stigmatizing, mental health and everything like that. So thank you so much. It was wonderful to be here with all of you.
Yes, indeed. I echo that, and just I'm so grateful to have individuals like you all who have pure hearts, who are really seeking the real solutions, not an agenda, but a solution to enhance the health of people. And I think that that's really at the core here. Public safety is public health, and mental health permeates our criminal justice system. And the lack of it is what exacerbates the lack of safety that we feel. And so, again, thank you so much, Jeffrey and Kanita, for running this very, very magnificent panel that was able to really touch on the front end to the back end. And again, for all you out there in New York City who have been watching, please stay tuned. We have another panel coming up at 2 p.m., a very important panel speaking specifically about the ways in which women experience the many, many, many ramifications of incarceration, both personally and peripherally through those they support. So, New York, there's more to come and there's more to do, and it takes us to be that change. So thank you all. Love and light.
Thank you.
Peace and blessings, everyone.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, guys.